Welcome to our Network Alliance virtual Fireside chat. I'm Tom Skelton, Chief Executive Officer of Surescripts. Today, I am honored to be joined by Dr. Abernethy. Amy is the Principal Deputy Commissioner and Acting CIO of the FDA. We're honored to have Amy with us here today to talk to us about COVID and the information needs of public health. Now, before we dig in, let me welcome Amy. She's got an illustrious background and a fabulous resume. She's a hematologist, oncologist, palliative medicine physician. She is a clinical data expert and researcher who came to the FDA from her role as Chief Medical Officer, Chief Scientific Officer, and SVP at Flatiron Health, which was acquired by Roche, and where she then led research oncology. Amy, thanks for joining us. We're thrilled to have you here today. The only way we could be happier is if we were doing this truly live and in person.
It's great and terrific to be with you, Tom. Thank you.
All right, so the general format we're going to use here is Amy and I are going to chat back and forth for about the first 30 minutes or so, and then we'll turn it back over to the audience, and we'll allow you all to submit some Q&A, which will then wrap this up, and we'll let Dr. Abernethy get back to her day job. So, Amy, let's start by just chatting a bit about the FDA. Everybody knows that the FDA is out there. Everybody understands it to a degree, but it might be good to remind everybody kind of what its mission is and why it exists.
So as FDA, our mission is to protect and promote public health and also to support innovation. We do this through the regulation of a number of different industries. This includes the regulation of drugs and biologic products and devices, veterinary products, tobacco, food, cosmetics. And practically speaking, we are focused on ensuring efficacy, safety, and security of the products that we regulate.
Got it. And you joined, obviously, as I said in the intro, from private industry, came into the FDA, I think it was February of 2019, right? Somewhere around that time?
Yes,
and so
exactly.
you're leaving private industry, you come into the FDA. As you're coming in the door, this is all pre-COVID. At that point, what were your priorities and what were the things that you were seeking to achieve in taking the role?
So as I came into the agency, which was really right at the end of 2018, going to 2019, the way I always remember this is I came into the agency during the government shutdown. So you can kind of think about it, that's when it started. And at the time, my key areas of focus were going to include patient-centered personalized medicine. It was going to include real-world data and real-world evidence, and really trying to move forward with issues in innovation as it related to totality of the evidence. And
go ahead.
No, please. And that was the sort of key area of focus at that time, highlighting really what I had done in my prior life, both at Duke as well as at Flatiron.
So coming into the FDA with that mindset, those types of objectives, what were the challenges that you immediately identified coming out of private industry into a government agency as large and as influential as FDA?
So, I had been working in the real world data space, for example, and really thought, okay, this is the chance to advance the clinical evidence generation and the state of that science. And what I realized was that if we were going to move forward with personalized medicine, if we were going to move forward with real world data, totality evidence, patient centricity, we needed to first make sure that the agency was prepared from a data and technology perspective to be able to participate in that kind of universe in a very efficient fashion. And so, in fact, in about April of 2019, I added into the principal deputy role the role as the acting chief information officer, really to try and figure out how do we develop a strategy and a way forward as an agency for data and tech modernization that aligned with moving those critical areas and fields forward.
Yeah, that's a big mission. Lots of change management involved there. How did the team react to that?
Interesting question. So I think that many were still trying to get their head around why do the issues of data and tech modernization align with questions related to, for example, personalized medicine, or even the security of our food supply. And so in beginning, the general reaction was, you must be doing two separate jobs. And in September of 2019, so basically exactly a year ago, we put out the Technology Modernization Action Plan that highlighted our plans for developing a more modern agency that uses the cloud and data in new ways, and also develops new ways of working in collaborative environments. And I think that actually started to highlight across the agency, but also across the industries that we regulate, how as an agency using data and tech differently, that also prepares us for this landscape of essentially being ready for smaller drug applications, for personalized medicine therapies that ultimately may mean many, many years of follow-up, or continuous real-world performance evaluation of devices that may be more continuously changing, such as software as a medical device. So all of these things that are coming that need a more technologically forward agency to be able to accommodate them.
Great. Sounds like that makes it a much more exciting place to be. I mean, moves the agency into a really exciting space between the data, the analytics, et cetera. Have you noticed a difference in the type of talent that tries to join as a result of that?
Absolutely. That's an interesting question. So, certainly from the perspective of making sure that we not only have a strategic plan, but a strategic plan that we can action, we need the right people on the team. And we've been able to get there by a few elements. So first is that we have a number of very senior level hires, a new chief technology officer, Vid Desai, who's come from industry, a new chief data officer, Ram Iyer, who's come from industry. So very senior leaders who have forward-thinking visions, but also great experience in their own right, who are attracting new talent. But then we've also really focused on new ways of working as a data and technical organization that showcases for the whole agency, how do we change culture? How do we unleash elastic capacity that already exists in the people that work with us every day? And how do we prepare for new capabilities and types of talent to come to the agency in the future, whether that is people who understand product development, people who are thinking about artificial intelligence and machine learning, or people who are thinking across our entire agency, how do we put data to work in new ways?
Right. That's fabulous. And, obviously with those types of backgrounds, the issue of real world data and things like that, it's kind of front and center for you anyway, but then they bring in that much more of it because they have the experience and they have that toolkit with them. So now let's jump back also a little bit and talk about, what pieces of healthcare were front and center for the FDA? I know that, pre-COVID, the things that were on our minds as we kind of watched the FDA were kind of the approval process for medications and certain devices. Opioids were always front and center. That was something that sat out there. I seem to recall hearing Scott Gottlieb talk a lot about vaping and some of the impacts of that. What were the things that were on the minds of the agency that you would be applying these new approaches to help solve pre-COVID?
It's really interesting. As I think about what was in my mind September 2019, which was like a year ago, right? So you mentioned vaping. So suddenly we were in the middle of a national crisis related to vaping related lung illness, so EVALI. And one of the things that was on the mind of the agency is how do we create the right kind of surveillance system in partnership with the CDC so we can identify people who may be suffering from EVALI and figure out what in the world is going on. Another thing that was on our mind kind of the time was the romaine lettuce foodborne illness outbreak, and how do we continue to do the right kind of tracing in near real time so that we can isolate foodborne illness outbreaks and really essentially not only isolate them and pull products off the market and maybe making people sick, but do so in a way that doesn't pull everything off the market, just goes to those individual areas. So we're really thinking about that. Another thing that was high in our mind is within the context of the inspection space, how do we know really efficiently what container to inspect as a shipping container or a truck coming across the border, so that we can figure out which one might be a container containing violative seafood, so stinky fish. Or you mentioned opioids. So within the context of our international mail facilities, how do we quickly identify packages that may contain products coming in the United States, such as fentanyl or carbafentanil or kratom. So things like that. These sort of really important efficiency and public health surveillance activities. That married with one other thing I would say was really important on our mind this time last year, which is you mentioned the cadence and importance of the routine regulatory review that we do for drugs and other products. We're not only do we have in our mind how do we do that work well and more efficiently, and that was one of the questions that we had, but the other part of that was, wait a second, as biology has gotten better, our understanding and through scientific discovery has improved, we have more and more products coming through the pipelines for clinical development. How do we keep pace with that expanding book of work and make sure that as an agency we're as efficient as possible?
Right. So it's pretty clear that a year ago, you already had a pretty full plate, right? You're in the middle of trying to bring some new approaches to this and trying to really dive deep into the world of analytics, real-time data, real-world data, all of those types of things. You know, you've got romaine lettuce and vaping on one hand, you've got opioids and all kinds of other craziness on the other. And then at a certain point, you know, there's kind of a timeout called, and all of a sudden, seems like COVID is front and center each and every day. At least that's how it felt to us. What was that pivot like for you and for your organization?
So I'm gonna think back to January and February. So in January, we had announced our plans to make 2020 the year of our data modernization strategic development. I announced at the Consumer Electronics Show. And I remember being in Las Vegas for CES and thinking to myself, this conversation that's going on related to this illness we're hearing about in Wuhan may be pretty important to us. I, kind of also sort of think back to February 26th, when there was sort of the announcement of the activities that were going to take place nationally as it relates to coronavirus, and thinking to myself, if we're going to be putting this much muscle behind this nationally, do we have the data ready to be able to figure out what's going on at scale as efficiently as we need it? I had just learned through the process of the Valley conversation what all was and was not possible. And between that time of early January to February 26th, I was really starting to get worried about what I knew from a Valley that was and was not doable, and how are we going to fix it on the fly when, practically speaking, we had all the intention to work on this over the year, but now suddenly it was the early March and we needed to solve problems differently.
Right. So you're in a situation where you've had a chunk of time, almost a year, in fact, to kind of assess the capabilities of the organization, also where some of the challenges are. So the pivot occurs at that point. You've got a rapid acceleration of all of this. And I like the way you put that. You're in effect trying to change the tire while the car is going down the road, right? So how do you balance that? And what's your message to the team as you're going through this?
Well, it's interesting. And it wasn't until about 3 seconds ago, Tom, as you were asking that question, that I had an aha moment in my own mind. So I'm going to sort of answer this reflecting on that aha, which is that we sort of essentially developed two parallel paths as it related to data strategy. So one path was the one that we were already set on, which was the data and technology pathway for modernization and our modernization activities at the agency, both from the tech modernization and our cloud forward strategy, as well as how are we now going to work on issues as it relates to acquiring data, data governance, new ways of using data, artificial intelligence. And that book of work has stayed on track, although accelerated, and in fact, moving forward more quickly. And then we also developed a different parallel book of work. Actually, the aha I just had is that the reason that they've been able to happen in parallel is because I had two different hats. So on my CIO hat, I maintained the data modernization pathway. And then under my principal deputy hat, we developed another set of strategies about how do we really tap into the larger community of data and analytics and health systems and payer and other systems and activities across the United States to now more systematically solve the problem sitting right in front of us. And we did that really starting in March as a totally parallel pathway.
So let's talk a little bit about that. So obviously the need for real-time data became an imperative, right? I mean, you didn't have a choice. You had to get your hands on that. Tell me a little bit about how the FDA went about that, where private industry was able to help and help you move ahead very quickly, and where also still some of the stumbling blocks in trying to get that information occurred.
So really an important period of time for us. And that's the reason why I want to make sure that I really highlight this difference between two very parallel paths. Because what happened in March was we realized that we needed to figure out better ways to develop relationships and access data sets that were already being formed, perhaps pre-COVID, but now could inform our COVID activities. And one of the key aspects when it comes to data, and I think, Tom, you can appreciate this, is that moving data around, learning how to store it and manage it, learning how to work with somebody else's data, there's a lot of work and development that goes into that. And we really were concerned about that developmental time actually becoming itself its own handicap in the beginning of addressing COVID. So instead what we did was think about how can we create new partnerships across industries in ways that ultimately allow data holders, analytic teams, people who are interested in solving problems in COVID to start working on the problems that we're worried about as well. And so in order to do that, examples are, we created a prioritized list of questions that FDA is really interested in trying to understand and that all across industry people could go after. We created a safe space, a public-private partnership managed through the Reagan-Udall Foundation, which is the congressionally mandated foundation for the FDA, that provides a public-private partnership space for different groups and companies to actively work together. Yeah. We thought about what tools were needed so that the prioritized research questions could be answered quickly, such as what are the right common data elements and how might you think about case finding, for example, among your data sets, so that those standardized tools, which were informed by this community of science and researchers and data and data scientists working together, could actually now continuously use across this community. And so, in fact, that book of work really started helping solve real-time problems, and those problems then helped us to feed into what we need to do now into the future.
Got it. And I recall vividly those conversations you and I had at the time, right? Which was about, how much of this is about data versus what the analytics tell us about that data, and how are you going to invest your time, and how would you like us to invest our time to help you? I thought they were quite constructive, and I'm sure that moving to a partnership model was an approach in your strategy that may have gotten a lot more attention than it would have in the initial cut that was developed pre-COVID.
Yes. And so, I think, one thing I'll just say there that is really important. And because of the model, it allowed us to start answering questions together quickly. So one question that Surescripts was interested in trying to understand at the time was patterns of outpatient prescribing within the context of people with COVID-19. Something we really needed to understand, what's going on out there, right? Another thing that we were really interested in, still are interested in, is what's the natural history of COVID? What are the long-term sequelae people are experiencing? What's mortality look like? Who's on the ventilator? Those kind of things. Yep. So that by rapidly starting to answer these questions, it also stimulated a series of ahas, both at the agency for things that we now realized that we could start to make inquiries about, that we didn't realize that there were ways to action that data, as well as across all of these different partners who started then doing more work on their own. And it's created this ability to almost create a living textbook of what's going on within the context of COVID-19.
So then you get deeper into COVID, right? There's that initial learning and you're reaching out and you're trying to partner with the people that have data sets and have the analytics teams that may be able to answer some of the key questions that you and your team have identified. Now, as we get deeper into the situation, how is this, what's going on currently, and how has this informed your view of data and public health?
Oh, it's interesting. So I want to take what you've just asked and break it into some big chunks. So the first is that what is it teaching us about COVID? So certainly this book of work, as I just alluded to, has started to teach us around the ahas about COVID, but actually it's also allowed us to really understand the unfolding pandemic. And my one way of describing that is, in March, we were thinking about hospitalization rates and mortality and who goes on the ventilator. By May and June, we were starting to realize that it's partly also a blood clotting problem and issues around people who are developing problems with their kidneys. Subsequent to that, we start to realize now there's actually some cardiac issues and neurologic issues that we're worried about. And now in September, October, we're really starting to understand some of the long-term sequelae and late effects that need, all of which in these sort of evolving descriptions now help us think about, so what clinical trials need to be done? What do we need to think about in terms of portfolio of therapies, as well as portfolio of diagnostic tests, and how does this inform the understanding around vaccines? So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing is your question as it related to data in a public health emergency. And, you know, all of this, from my perspective, has taught me that in a public health emergency, in sort of the landscape of data in general, the usual thinking is just give it all to me and I'll take care of it. And in fact, in the context of a public health emergency like this, where really you have to do really hard work at scale, and I'm going to come back to this hard work piece in just a second, but you have to do really hard work at scale, you need to parallelize it, just like anything else. And that means you need many, many teams working on the problems rather than any one team saying it's all mine. And so that's really was really important in the context of trying to answer questions, and I think it will continue to be important. The last thing I would say is we learned, and we are continuing to learn, this is hard work. Hard things are hard, but you know, there was sort of this naivete of course we know how to do this kind of science. This is just business analytics and descriptive statistics. And you know, of course we understand who's got COVID, but all of those of courses don't really line up and work, as we've sort of seen. And so acknowledging that it is hard work to do, that we have to do it transparently so we can constantly learn from each other and cross-check each other's work really quickly. And having that humility has been a really key part of getting this work done.
Wow, great. Thank you for that comprehensive answer. So let's wrap up this section with just one more quick question here. Obviously, there's a lot of regulatory oversight in healthcare. Are there areas that you would expect to get a lot of attention from the regulatory side as a result of these learnings from COVID?
I want to make sure that I am answering the question in the way that you intended it. So do you want to sort of define what you mean by from the regulatory side? Do you mean from the FDA side, CMS, other places?
Well, I'm talking predominantly here as it relates to data, the FDA's ability to get, and maybe more broadly, you know, for the entire, you know, healthcare infrastructure of government to get its hand on the information that is needed to appropriately protect the populace. Anything that you see there coming out of that, or is it a situation where you look at it and go, you know what, I think from a regulatory standpoint, the regulations held up well and they did what we needed them to do?
Oh, I get it. What are you going after now? You know, I think that we're going to stop at the end of COVID. It may be in the middle of COVID and at the end of COVID, and take stock of what have we learned. And in fact, at FDA, we're already embarking on a midterm review to try and figure out how do we take lessons learned and codify that now, as well as what do we need to do and how does that inform the future. So I think that this will ultimately lead to a number of new ahas, but for the most part, the regulatory environment has held up well. And the thing that I thought you were getting at was as it relates to the use of these data sets to make specific medical product decisions at FDA, and have I seen that happen? I think we're going to continue to see that type of activity happen, whether it's because we're going to need real-world data and information from post-marketing surveillance type data sets to understand how vaccines are performing for many different types of people, or how we use real data to understand the performance of new diagnostic tests coming to the market. I think we're going to see a lot of those kinds of activities continue, but it's hard to know any one particular answer at the moment.
So for the folks in our audience that are listening that are part of private industry, is there anything that you'd like to send along in terms of messages to those of us in particular that are building technology or making extensive use of data and may have those data sets that you all are looking to partner with? Anything you'd like to pass along there?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important here is that as we develop new ways of working, as we acknowledge that this is hard work to do, it is really important that we have all the kinds of voices at the table to try and understand the problem and come up with the creative solutions. Most of this work is what I call FDA adjacent. These aren't products that are being regulated by FDA, but these are data sets and activities that are being used by all of us across really healthcare to try and figure out what's going on and what's the right lessons forward. So I think one of my kind of key learnings here is beware of vendor relationships where people just say this is what you're going to do, because a lot of times those kind of dictated do this, do that, sort of sets of activities miss the creativity that are needed to come up with truly new solutions. And so I've really been working on how do we come up with partnership models that acknowledge that the creativity comes from brainstorming about how we're going to solve this problem. And in fact, our technology modernization action plan, part 3 of the plan, was explicitly opening up communication channels and new ways to come up with new solution finding.
Great. And, it sounds like innovation is going to be an important part of this. It sounds like the partnership models will continue to grow and evolve based on some of the learnings and some of the future needs. What other types of innovation do you expect the FDA to now stay focused on as a result of some of the learnings coming out of COVID?
So, I think one of the big areas that I see as persisting is going to be this familiarity of how we can use data to answer many different questions that we have across the agency, as opposed to the sort of like classic thinking of data as something that either is acquired in a clinical trial or acquired in something that's intended to be a substitute for a clinical trial. And my examples here are using data to help us understand the medical product supply chain, to plan for and address drug and device shortages, to help us think about issues as it relates to foodborne outbreaks and how we might manage them better. These are all issues that can be solved better through data. And I think we have this opportunity now at the agency to have learned through COVID and become more familiar with that. And also, what are the capabilities that will allow us to do that?
Great, thank you. Ready to do a little Q&A?
Sure.
All right, let's take a look here and see what we have. All right, so here's our first one. What regulatory issues present challenges for your data modernization activities in bringing real-world data into the public health space?
So what regulatory issues create challenges?
Yep.
I think that a lot of people are concerned about HIPAA as a challenge, or sort of privacy issues as challenges. And my first thought there is there are issues to be worked through, and we run into many times places where we would like to have linked data sets or like to know more, but are but find that there is a trip tripwire because of issues around HIPAA and privacy. But every single time that happens, I think several things. So first of all, thank God we have privacy regulations in place, and they may even become more definitive regulations in the future, which just forces us into number two, coming up with more and more innovative solutions that respect and maintain privacy while allowing us to do our work together in smart ways. And so that takes me to the last piece as it relates to this, which is that many of these sort of seeming regulatory hurdles, we've really been thinking about at the agency, what are new innovations that solve the real problem people are worried about so that we can all doing our work. And so two examples that we've been talking a lot about in the context of COVID have been synthetic data sets as well as tokenization, both being technical solutions that may help in a privacy sparing way get around some of the things that currently worry us.
All right, thank you. How has the FDA clinical trial process evolved for COVID-19 vaccines, and what changes to the clinical trial process might stick beyond COVID-19 vaccines?
So I am going to not speak about vaccines specifically, but take it up a level and sort of say clinical trial process for medical products overall. Because, okay, we're developing drugs, we're developing vaccines, the we being the global we of the healthcare community. And as FDA, we're not developing them, we're regulating them. But the clinical trial process has seen a number of innovations in the context of COVID-19. And those innovations include, for example, the use of telemonitoring as a part of remote visits for patients on clinical trials. I mean, remember, the people weren't able to go to the doctor for a number of months, right? And yet, if you were on a clinical trial, what do you do? How do we ensure safety? And how do we ensure also that the data is being collected for the clinical trial data set? And so we had already had in place guidance and advice around remote monitoring and the use of decentralized clinical trials. But for the most part, that still had been not a well-used path of development for clinical trials. And so this is an example of how I think that there's going to be persisting innovation. It also, another similar example within the context of clinical trials and change in clinical trials was and continues to be the question around the use of real world data, massively collected data sets, the electronic health record or claims data to fill in parts of the clinical trial data set because patients couldn't come for their visits or because of the need for remote and long-term monitoring. And then the third example is the ability to deliver investigational product, the drug, for example, to the patient or close to the patient's home so that they didn't need to travel to Houston or New York City for their care. And each of those were innovations putting in place because of the realities of the pandemic that also give us the opportunity at the end of the public health emergency to step back and say, how did they perform? Our worries are usually about safety and integrity of the data set. What's the true impact on those two elements and whether or not these novel solutions can kind of persist in the clinical trials environment? And I think those are the kind of things you're going to see.
Great. Thanks, Amy. Appreciate all that detail. Let's see here. How do you see the role of the FDA evolving as artificial intelligence and machine learning enable more powerful and beneficial points of care, or more beneficial point of care clinical decision support tools?
Really great, interesting question. So, so first of all, let me sort of get at how I usually think about machine learning and AI-based solutions from an FDA perspective. And I bucket it into three main categories. So there are those AI-based solutions where there are components of products that we directly regulate. So for example, software that uses an AI construct that's really a device that we regulate, and clinical decision support falls into that category. Some clinical decision support, not all. The second category is what I call FDA adjacent. These are products that we don't necessarily directly regulate as FDA, but they're used in the evaluation of products that we regulate, or somehow in the development of products. So for example, AI solutions to help the curation of data sets that then are used as data sets for a product that's submitted. And then the third is AI and ML-based solutions that we use at the agency to help us do our work better. So AI that helps us predict which container to inspect to look for those stinky fish, that kind of thing. So that's how I categorize this. Do I see AI and ML advancing the clinical decision support space? Absolutely. We're in the process of prototyping different new regulatory approaches, so piloting them in order to understand what's the right regulatory solution to go along with the fact that these solutions can be continuously updating, and we need to be able to not only regulate them across time as they update, but not gum up the system. So importantly, we want to be able to both, as a whole country, derive the value of these kinds of products while making sure that they're safe and effective. And so the new regulatory pathways, I think, are in development.
Great. Now, I got a question here. The FDA launched the Digital Health Center of Excellence last month. Can you tell the audience a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Digital Health Center for Excellence is a new initiative, a new center within our Devices Center, CDRH, and is intended to be a coordination hub and also a key resource for the agency, starting with the Devices Center. The Digital Health Center for Excellence really starts to help think through what are the unique elements that we need to understand, in order to regulate or use digital health products. And certainly most of those digital health products right now exist within the device space, although some of them are becoming more and more relevant to, for example, drugs and biologics. And so the Center for Excellence really serves as a resource. I would say that the Center for Excellence also helps as a beacon to remind us at the agency and also across the industries that we regulate that it's important to have at the agency the right kinds of people who have core understanding in this space to support the new regulatory activities. So sort of the talent question, and also supports a coordinating function of what are the problems we're going to need to solve, both from a regulatory perspective as well as a scientific perspective, in order to move this space forward.
Great. So one of our partners is asking the question, you've commented on this partnership focus going forward. Can you elaborate on that a bit and maybe give an example of a partnership that, a type of partnership that private industry could expect to see? And also, what's really gone well with the partnerships that you've done, and where have you also seen challenges so that private industry may be able to step towards you to make some of this easier?
So when I think about partnerships, and importantly, we're talking about the data and tech modernization space. So, I want to make sure we're not sort of talking about partnerships specific to developing certain kinds of drugs or those kind of things. So this is a space where data and technology is not something we directly regulate. We don't specific, except for when it is a part of software medical device. And that's why I want to make sure that I'm clear about that. But, what kinds of partnerships you can expect to see persist? I think really good examples are like what we've seen come out of the Evidence Accelerator example. So the Evidence Accelerator is that public-private partnership that was developed and managed the Reagan-Udall Foundation in service of COVID-19, and where as FDA, as an active participant, we've been able to see all kinds of different data and technology capabilities that exist across the space. Some of those have led to, for example, research collaborative agreements, where FDA and a specific company or group of companies have come together with a clear handshake through a research collaboration to really dig in deep and understand what needs to be done in order to leverage a certain kind of data or technological capability. So I see that as a good example of a partnership that's been working well. Other examples that have come from that is increased familiarity at FDA of technology capabilities that exist across the software and technology industry that we didn't really sort of think about or kind of embed in our way of thinking of how clinical development might happen in the future. So that's sort of this, what I call familiarity activity.
Yeah.
If you're a company and you want to know what does it mean to sort of get involved and be involved in these partnerships, two things. One is, as I mentioned at the Consumer Electronics Show, and as you'll see through a series of public meetings in 2020 and going forward, we have a series of listening sessions, public meetings, ways for industry to communicate with us formally, including formal dockets. And that's important because it essentially gets into well-documented mechanisms, ideas, and ways that industry thinks about this, how this might move forward. Also, for example, the Evidence Accelerator continues and has over 600 participants now. There's several meetings a week, and people come to those meetings. And there's also 2 capabilities presentations every other week in those meetings. So www.evidenceaccelerator.org, and you can learn more about how that might be a space to participate in. And I think the third thing I'd say is watch this space. My hope is that it continues with this kind of facility and keeps heating up.
Well, I mean, there's no question that you all have a lot on your plates, and you're moving at what I would consider to be a pretty rapid pace. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to spend a little bit with us and with our audience today. Appreciate the insights. Appreciate you sharing your views and some of the journey that you've been on there and helping us understand what to look out for. Is there any ask you have or any final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience today as we adjourn this?
So, I think my ask is that we continue with diligence and urgency to work on the pandemic. And that as we're doing our work together in the pandemic, that we are also keeping an eye towards what are we learning that we want to put in place and advance for the future. Now, I'm really appreciative and amazed by everybody's continued effort to try and move the needle and do the right thing here. And I think we've developed new ways of working, and I'd like to see that persist.
Terrific. Amy, thanks again very much. Really do appreciate your time today, and good luck to you as you continue to go out there and slay those dragons for us. We all appreciate your efforts.
Thank you. Be safe.
Take care. Bye-bye.